Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carolyn Mendez-Luck.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for inviting me to share my work around caregiving in Latino families. I hope you're all doing well, considering the COVID environment that we're all living in today. So you might be wondering about this picture, and I want to say yes, that is me on the left-hand side, and I'm going to talk to you more about this picture in just a little bit. So before I begin, I want to mention or acknowledge the funders for the research that I'm going to talk to you about today, and also about the research assistants and collaborators and mentors that really helped with this research and the body of work that I'll be talking to you about. You know, when they say it takes a village, it really does when this project is concerned. And I wouldn't be here tonight talking about the research were it not for all the people listed on this slide. And lastly, I want to say that the sources of the images that you'll see today come from my personal collection, from Shutterstock licensing, and also from from Unsplash. So there are 4 kinds of people in the world: those who have been caregivers, those who are currently caregivers, those who will be caregivers, and those who will need caregivers. So Rosalind Carter said this several decades ago. And in essence, caregiving touches all families at some point or another in their lives, and it acts in different ways, plays out differently in family situations. It's been said that informal caregiving is the backbone of our long-term care system in the United States, and I agree with this. The unpaid work that families do is estimated to be around $375 to $450 billion annually. A recent report estimated that family caregiving saves states and federal governments up to $642 billion annually that would have otherwise been spent on formal home-based care and institutional care. So just imagine that, all what people are doing on behalf of their loved ones, what it amounts to if we were to pay everybody what they deserve. So we know that the US population is aging, but it's also becoming increasingly diverse. In fact, as this graph shows from the Brookings Institution, that racial and ethnic minority populations are growing at a faster pace than the white population. Between the year 2010 and 2019, over 10 million individuals added to the population were of Latino descent, followed by 4.2 million or 4.3 million of Asian American descent, and then followed by 3.2 million of Black descent. Yet on the other hand, the white population actually shrunk during the same period by 16,612 individuals. And so the growing diversity in the population can also be seen in the 65 population as well. So these are 2 pie charts, and on the left-hand side shows the distribution in the older adult population, 65 and older, in the year 2010. And what this shows is that that the majority of older adults in 2010 were white, so 80.2%, followed by African American at 8% and Latino at 7.1%. So if we fast forward 30 years from now, in the year 2050, we'll see that while whites will still make up the majority of the 65 plus population, their slice of the pie, so to speak, has really shrunk considerably, and that Latinos will grow dramatically to almost 20% of all older adults. So this demographic change has some potentially significant implications for aging and caregiving, as I'm going to describe in the next few slides. So first, what's not on this slide is something I just want to make sure that I say, and that's that Latino adults on average have a higher life expectancy than adults from other populations. So, for example, at birth, a Latino female can expect to live 83.7 years on average, compared to 81.7 years for Asian and non-Latino white females at birth. And this advantage extends to Latino males as well, compared to other males from other populations. And also extends, this advantage in longevity also extends at the age of 65 and at the age of 85. So for example, if you're a Latino woman and you make it to the age 65, you can expect to live another 22 years after that, compared to 20 years for her white and Asian counterparts at that age. If that same woman reaches 85, she can expect to live, let me get this right, she can expect to live 8 years longer. And that compares to 7 years for white and Asian women at that same age, at 85. So on average, Latino individuals are living longer. They can expect to live longer lives than anyone else in the population, in the US population. So then why do I say poor aging outlook for many Latinos? Well, there are several factors with that. And there are three on the left that I'm going to talk very briefly about. One is educational level, and then the second is poverty, and the third is insurance coverage and access to care. So these three factors are what we call the social determinants of health, and there are many other determinants of health, but these are three key ones. And when we think about education, Latinos on average have lower education levels, meaning that a lower percentage of Latinos will graduate from high school and also go into higher education and graduate from higher education like college. Second, in terms of poverty, well, we know education and income are very closely tied together, so then it may not be a surprise that many Latinos will find themselves at risk for poverty. So the rate of poverty is higher in Latinos in general compared to other populations. And then third, this insurance coverage. So again, Latinos have higher uninsured rates and less access to care. So if you don't have insurance, it's really hard to get access to go to the doctor and get a service when you need it. So when you add up all of those things together, it's what we call multiple disparities. And so it creates this condition for people that, or puts them at risk, that's a better way to say it, puts them at risk for having diseases and problems in their health that they didn't necessarily need to have if, for example, they had a higher income and they could afford health insurance or had access to care. So these, what we call disparities, they accumulate over time, so that by the time a Latino person reaches older age, they are more likely to reach it being in poorer health. So while Latinos may live longer, they will do so with having more morbidity or more burden of disease across their lives. So then it may not be a surprise to find then that Latino caregiving families have a greater burden of care. And because of this, the risk of Latinos having poor health when they get older. So what this graph shows you is the caregivers with higher intensity of care. So this provision of care at a really intense level. And Latinos, 49% of Latinos are in this high intensity caregiving situation, second only to African Americans, but substantially higher than non-Latino white Americans or caregivers, I should say, and Asian American caregivers. And so when we think about intensity, this is a report that is done by the National Alliance for Caregiving and AARP. This is a report that they put out every year on caregiving, and they measure care intensity in a couple of different ways. So one is the number of hours provided on a weekly basis. The second is how many forms of care is being provided from a basic standpoint and also from an instrumental standpoint, and I'll tell you what those are. So from a basic standpoint is like, does a caregiver help feed, bathe, help the person to get dressed, toilet, those kind of very basic activities that people need to like live and survive on a daily basis. And then those instrumental activities are activities that are more along the lines of, well, you need to be already functionally at a higher level in order to be able to do them. So for example, helping with transportation, having somebody help you go to the grocery store, pay your bills, cook a meal, help you manage your medication, those kinds of things. So when you add up all of those different types of activities, and I think there's like a total of 13 of them, along with the number of hours helping per week, that's what creates this higher intensity of care. And that's what we find Latino families, almost half of them, caregivers, in that situation. So not only are they in this situation, but they're also in this situation at a greater financial cost. So what this graph shows is the average out-of-pocket spending on caregiving related expenses. And you can see from this slide that, that Latino caregivers are spending way more out of pocket on caregiving expenses than caregivers from other groups. On average, all Latinos are spending $9,000 per year. And you can see that Latino females are spending more. Can you press it? Can you forward the next? And so what this shows you, this slide, is, okay, what is the percentage of these expenses as a share of a person's annual income? And so again, we see that for Latino male and female caregivers, they're spending a lot of their annual income on caregiving expenses. On average, for Latinos, all Latinos, it's 44%, which is significantly higher than caregivers in all of these different groups. But what's really striking here is that 47%, or for female Latino caregivers, they're spending 47% on average of their annual income on caregiving expenses. So all of this that I've just showed you, it's important to understand, I think, because all of these factors kind of combine to really, I think it's going to become worse in the future, so to speak, because of the growth in the Latino population in the coming decades, the fact that they have a poor health outlook when they get older, and caregivers are already stretched in terms of their finances and their the level of care that they're providing. And so we can see this really coming to a head in the coming decades, and really being a burden on these families when they already have such low resources to start with, and they're at a disadvantage. But before I go any further into my talk, I just want to say a couple of things. First is that I recognize that caregiving isn't unique to Latino families, even though I just told you how important it is and everything. It's not unique. That the slides I also showed that there are caregivers from all of these different population groups that are doing this hard work. So it's happening everywhere. It just happens to be that this is the area that I focus on, is Latino caregiving. And the second thing that I want to acknowledge is that when we talk about Latinos, we often think about them as one big group, that all Latinos are the same. And we know that that's not true, that they're not a monolithic group, that there are many different Latino cultures, and each culture has its unique features and characteristics. So what may be important and prominent in, let's just say, Cuban culture may not be the same as it is in Mexican culture or Guatemalan culture, for example. So I just want to recognize that there is this heterogeneity out there among Latinos. I will be talking about Mexican culture because that's where my research resides. But it's important to note that not all Latino cultures are the same. So these are some of the cultural beliefs that I'm going to touch upon today in Mexican culture. And so the first is the family. So there's this concept of familism that I'm going to be talking about. And then the second is this, the centrality of the elder in the Mexican family, so aging and the elderly, I'm going to touch on. And of course, as it relates to caregiving, the social and gender roles. And I just want to say that when we talk about Mexican culture and all of these different cultural beliefs, it's really hard to disentangle what's social versus what's religion versus what is indigenous. There's such an intricate and complicated fabric in Mexican society that's composed of all of these different things that date back long ago. That's mystical, that's religious, that's spiritual, that's also impacted by other social trends in Mexican society. So when I talk about it, some of it might sound religious, but really you have to think about it as a whole, because there's no way to really say, well, this particular gender role is because of this particular culture or this societal fact. It really truly is this interwoven fabric. So I am going to show you a very short clip from this film, and I hopefully some of you have seen it, and then I'm going to talk about it afterward. Hopefully some of you have seen that, but if not, I think that clip encapsulates a lot of what I'll be talking about today. This commitment to family and the love for each other, and sort of that depth of that commitment and how far it goes. It extends beyond just the living, but also to the dead. There's also some spirituality about that and beliefs around that. And so I'm going to try to relate Miguel's story to what I'm going to talk about in terms of these beliefs. So this first one is called family, or in the literature, it's also called familism or familismo. And really what that is a commitment to a family as a structure and an idea that supersedes the individual's achievement or acknowledgement or rewards. So we could see that how Miguel and his family interacted with each other, and how they supported their great-grandmother Coco, and how they were just committed and that they loved each other. And he said, in his proud corazón, which means in his proud heart. And that love will live on forever. So it really shows that commitment to the family as one big unit. Another part of familism is this extended family orientation, as shown in the clip, when they were dancing around in their party, whatever celebration that was for. It was probably, I think it was the Day of the Dead for the next year. That the family extends beyond just the nuclear unit of blood and marriage. It can include individuals that are not related but become family, like maybe your neighbors or close friends, and sometimes we call that fictive kin. It also includes aunts and uncles and cousins. And so it's this really big horizontal structure, and that extends, like I said, beyond the mother, father, brother, sister unit that we often see here as an ideal in the United States and American culture. And then the third characteristic is this multi-generational household. And that's having a household like that is governed by norms of mutuality, mutual assistance, of primary reliance on the family, so relying on each other. We saw that again in the clip with Miguel and his family. They all lived together in their home. And in fact, they all worked in the family shoe business. So in essence, when we think about familismo, we think about families that function as a unit, and individuals are expected to behave in ways that support the family as a whole, rather than having one's own individual wishes. And then this picture here is just a picture of my family. again, just showing that this collectiveness that we have. And I think this was just at one of our dinners out a little over 10 years ago. So as we saw in the clip too, that Coco was the center of the family, right? The whole, in fact, the movie was named after her. And so elders in the Mexican family are important to the family. And the reason why is because they're at the center, well, first they're at the center of the social network. So both in terms of the family, but also in the community or the neighborhood. They are esteemed because they have knowledge and wisdom. And they fulfill an important role by socializing younger generations on what's important to the family, how to behave in the family. They provide leadership in times of crisis. They transmit cultural knowledge and family knowledge as well. So they're like family historians. And this picture, these two pictures here, one is of my grandma and grandpa Andy on my dad's side. They were always at every single function that we would have, whether it was Christmas or Easter or just getting together to go out to dinner to Chinatown. We would do that a lot. And then the one on the right, the other one is my grandma Pete, my mom's mother, and my daughter Stephanie when she was younger, and my Aunt Della, who's actually the sister of my grandma Andy. And so again, this just shows sort of warmth and love. And I think this was at an Easter celebration that we had years ago. Okay, so talking about gender roles, what are the traditional gender roles? And I want to preface this by saying that these are traditional gender roles, and this is what is described in the literature. And times are changing, and these roles might not resonate with some people's experiences in their own families. And there are certainly some social trends going on in Mexico right now that really reflect this change. But this is the traditional roles that I'm going to share very briefly. So first is the machismo role, and that's that's the male role in the family. The machismo is the breadwinner, the head of household, the decision maker, the authoritarian figure in the family. And then Marianismo is the women's role in the family. And it refers to feminine behaviors and expectations of women in the family. So it involves self-sacrifice in order to pursue the happiness of others and the overall good of the family. There's deference to authority. And really, it's this idea of the emulation of the Virgin Mary in the Catholic religion. So in order to be a good mother, a good daughter, a good wife, etc., you want to emulate the Virgin Mary and be the perfect mother. And we know that in the Catholic faith, the Virgin Mary is the mother of Jesus Christ. So that's kind of a high bar to live up to. Okay, so I said I was going to come back to this slide. And so this is a picture of me, my mother, Lenore, my grandmother, Pete, and my great-grandmother, Mamani, and my daughter there at the bottom in 1988, just after, maybe I don't really remember, maybe a month after my daughter was born. And so when I think of Marianismo, I often think of these women because they were my first, I guess, exposure and experience to what is it like to be a Mexican woman in a Mexican family. And so my grandmother helped my great-grandmother, and my mother would sometimes help my grandmother with that. And then my mother also took care of my grandmother as well as her mother-in-law. And so it really got me interested in thinking, what are the beliefs around the caregiving, and why is it that people do what they do, even when it's difficult and sometimes not convenient? How is it that these women take up the role? So this is where my initial interest stemmed. And so what I did was I went to Mexico City, and I spent a year there collecting data for my dissertation. And I interviewed women, asking them what they thought about the caregiving role and what their place was in Mexican society and in the family. And then when I graduated with my PhD, then I was back in the US, then I replicated that study, but with women in East Los Angeles, in the greater East Los Angeles area. So myself, along with several other students, and research team, we went in and we interviewed about 44 women, I believe 44 women, Mexican immigrant, also US-born Mexican-American women, on those same questions. What motivates you to be a caregiver? How do you see your role in the family as a caregiver, but also as a woman and also in larger society? So the next slides, the set of slides that I'll be showing you are actually the results of the analysis of the data that we collected. And so the way I've organized it is I've organized it in those same themes of those cultural beliefs that I just talked about. So the first one is familism. And so these are the words that you see here are words that caregivers used to describe their families and the Mexican family in general. So you can see lots of positive words, very warm and fuzzy, and in the way they described their family and the Mexican family in general. So this first quote comes from Erica. And so I wanted to give a little bit more depth, right, into what I just said about the Mexican family and the importance of it in these women's lives. So this first quote comes from Erica. She's a 24-year-old single woman. She had no children at the time of the interview, and she shared a household with her mother, father, 2 older sisters, and 2 nephews. She quit her job about 2 years prior to our interview with her so that she could care for her mother, who was diabetic and went blind due to a complication from cataract surgery. So when we asked her, well, why did you quit your job? She says, well, in our culture, family comes first. Okay, so again, this idea of the prominence of the family and sacrificing her job so that she could stay home and take care of her mom. So the next slide, the next quote, thank you, is from Paz, and she was 28 years old at the time of our interview, and she had been taking care of her 81-year-old father for 5 years because he had foot pain. And he had come from Mexico to live with her because he was on his own in Mexico, and he was complaining to her that he had to do everything for himself and that there was nobody there to help him. So he came over to live with her and her husband and their 2 children. And so when we asked her about, well, what's unique about the family? I mean, why did you do this? And she said, I believe it's the bond of the family, the trust that makes Mexican families special. So again, this centrality of the elder, right, in the social network of the family is important because they are connected. They are connected to their families. They're connected to their social network. And so just like in the movie, the clip that we just saw, and these principles of familism, the women talked about how important it was to keep the elders at the center of the family. It was important to their health. So companionship, attention, were all forms of social connectedness that the women saw as something important to maintain the elder's health. And the reason why is because it shows that they are loved and it keeps them engaged with their family. So then, not surprisingly, since family is so central and elders are so central to the women that we talked to, they thought that family care is best. And so they really felt that overall, that caring for their family member at home was the ideal caregiving situation, and that the majority of women that we interviewed saw that nursing homes, they viewed them as inferior in some way or less than to care in the home by family. So the first quote is from Luz Maria, and she was caring for her 62-year-old mother who suffered from varicose veins and memory problems. And Luz Maria had been caring for her mother for about 5 years when we interviewed her, and she felt that caring for the elderly in her home, was just something that you do because you have to keep them occupied, keep their mind occupied by having people around. And so she also said, as Mexicans, we don't abandon our parents in nursing homes. We do not leave them there. So that was a very common sentiment. And this next one explains a little bit more. And this is from 64-year-old Laura. and she was caring for her husband, who was 71. They had been married for 42 years, and she had been caring for him for the past 10 years. He had diabetes and was on kidney dialysis. And so, and because of the kidney dialysis, he was wheelchair bound. So he was really quite frail when she was taking care of him. And she says, we Mexicans are that way. We don't want to put them in a nursing home. We would rather have them in the house. There is more warmth in the home than in a nursing home. It's not very pretty there. It's colder, a bad environment and everything. There is more familial warmth in the home. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about Gloria. And Gloria was 31 years old. She was unmarried. She had no children, and she was one of 4 siblings. And at the time we interviewed her, she shared a small, cluttered 2-bedroom apartment with her mother and her sister and one of her brothers. Their household composition was always changing because of the job situations were in flux. And so depending on who had a job, they would move in and out of the home. And so she slept on the couch in order to give her mother her bedroom to share with her sister. And she had always lived with her mother her whole life, except for a short period of time when she went out on her own, but she came back. But she started to care for her mother after her father passed away I think it was about 5 years before we interviewed her. So she explains that we all help each other. If one has a problem, we can ask the other, can you help me with this? Because that's how my mom and dad taught us. Not like being in a little ball in our own world, not caring for anything. So she really, she relays through this quote how integrated her family is, how much they rely on each other, and how they do for each other when times call for that, and that they really rely primarily on each other. So when we talked about caregiving as a duty, she says, if you really feel connected to your mother or your father or whoever you're taking care of, it shouldn't feel like an obligation. It should feel like it's something that you want to do because you want them to be happy. It should be something that you want to do, not something that you're forced to do or have to do. And so this really conveys the sentiment of many other caregivers in this study, where they didn't feel that caregiving was an obligation, but more like a commitment. Even though some use the word obligation, they still felt that it was more of a positive thing, that's something that you should want to do because they're your parents, because we're repaying them, or because it's part of what it means to be in a family. So there's this aspect of choice, willingness, real positive views of caregiving. Now, that's not to say that there weren't some contradictions with that. So in this case, this is a contradiction. So this is Ophelia. She says, I asked them to do me a favor and go Saturday for a couple of hours to help me. Sometimes they don't even go. They're like, we're tired, we're sick. Thank you. Welcome to my world, you know? So Ophelia was 35 years old when we interviewed her. She was one of 3 siblings. She had been taking care of her mother and father since she was in high school. Her siblings were older than her, but she was really the one who had that role in the family of caregiving. And so what this shows is that even Ophelia she did have a positive view about caregiving, but she did acknowledge that people aren't helping me. So there's this contradiction of family's supposed to be close and united. We do for each other. But there's this conflict between how they describe how family should be versus what is actually happening in the family. And so you can see here, she was quite frustrated by the lack of help from her siblings. So the next cultural belief I'm going to talk about is Marianismo. And again, these are words that the caregivers used in describing the caregiving role and their motivations and views about caregiving. Again, all very positive overall, shows that willingness and choice and reciprocity, paying back parents for previous help, and also some degree of expectation, right? In terms of daughter, and wife. Like these are things that daughters and wives do. So I mentioned Luz Maria earlier, and she talked about what it meant to be a good daughter. She said, everything comes in one: duty, commitment, necessity. It almost means the same thing to me because it is an obligation. It's like an obligation that I feel that I alone have to do for my mother. It's not like she is asking me for it, but I am her daughter, and I have to help my mother. Like the Ten Commandments indicate, you must obey your father and mother so that you live a good life. So I am doing this. And so you can see that in this quote, she ties in the Marianismo aspect of obey your mother and father, right? And so there's that religious component, but also she did not draw a distinction between duty, commitment, necessity, right? So you can see there's some expectation with that, but then also that she's fulfilling her role as being a good daughter. So she's fulfilling that Marianismo role by helping her mother, and so that she can have a good life herself. So this is Olga. She's 50 years old, and she was born in East LA, and she had never been married. She has 2 siblings. She also has never had children. She's lived with her parents off and on for her entire life. And prior to our interview with her, she had been caring for her mother for about 10 years since she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And the last 5 years, she's been living full-time with her mother because she's been kind of in and out in her parents' home, but as an adult. If you can put
What were some of the things that you gave up? Because you said you gave up some
Well,
things.
so yeah, life. I don't have a life. My life is my mom.
What was your life before?
When I felt like going somewhere, I went. If it were a local gathering with a friend or 2 or 3, or even a movie. If I didn't have to ask anybody for permission. I just did. Being single. Travel. I love to travel. I can't afford that. Not only can I not afford it, but I cannot. Who do I leave my mom to?
Mm-hmm.
So what you can see here is, again, she's fulfilling that Marianismo role. She's self-sacrificing financially, she has, because she quit her job and she doesn't have the money to do the things that she wants to do. And even if she did, she couldn't just leave her alone because there's nobody to leave her mother to. So she really gave of her life. And that's a good example of some of the other women in our study that sacrificed themselves on behalf of their mother. And then she's going to continue to talk about where this suffering comes from.
Again, is it the Mexican culture? I don't know. Sufrimos, we suffer. That constant suffering, that constant, there's a melancholy.
Where does that come from?
Who the hell? Well,
I mean, what, in your opinion?
Honestly, I think it's church. I think it's learned. I think it's the meek shall inherit, the poverty. There's a lot of happiness, a lot of, let's celebrate. But underneath all of that, we celebrate because there's that undercurrent of this life. It's hard work. And I really honestly believe, I thought of it, I do think that the church adds to it. Like I said, the meek shall inherit, or we shall have a better life in the afterlife. Do what is expected of you here, suffer, give up, and it's a coping mechanism. I do think it's a coping mechanism.
And you're referring to the Catholic Church?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Is there any other?
In this excerpt, we hear her talking about it, and And what you may or may not catch as you listen to it is that she was crying throughout our interview. And as a matter of fact, when we first talked, we first began talking to each other, she just said, "I'm sorry I talk so much, because I have no one to talk to." And so she was very quick to cry, and she was very emotional throughout the interview. But this also shows, besides that, just shows that this tension, right, between what's expected and how to be the good daughter, but at the same time having that expectation and the difficulty of carrying that out. It also has this layer of sort of religious expectation, again coming from the Catholic faith that she talked about, and how do you be this Maria? How do you fulfill this Marianismo role? Because it's so hard. And she sees it as something that's coming from the church. In conclusion, we saw this first aspects of familismo, like this dedication to the family, these ideals of being united and close-knit, and really quite a beautiful dynamic at first blush. But when you look closer, you see that caregiving was an intricate mosaic that was complicated yet beautiful, hard, and this. And I chose this particular picture because it shows that intricateness of that beadwork to produce this. I think this is like a cougar or a cat of some kind, and that caregiving was fragile to some extent, right? And that there were some tensions between family members, and also tension between the ideal of what a Mexican family should be, but the reality of what it was and how it played out in caregiving in these women's lives. And then lastly, that caregiving came at a cost, right? This idea of being in that Marianismo role, that it came at a cost of self. And so we saw that play out as well. So I'm going to end that here. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about what I just covered, and as well as any other questions that you might have on caregiving. I want to thank you for sharing your time with me at the end of a long day for you, I'm sure. And I also just want to thank my parents, and that's their picture here. They're the reason why I do this work. Thank you.